Hi, everyone. This is our last recording on Chapter 3. We're going to be covering the challenging philosophy of Immanuel Kant. There's two areas that we're going to be looking at with this philosopher. One certainly will be his area on epistemology and his use of empiricism and kind of a combination really of empiricism and rationalism. We'll also then look at his ethics, what's oftentimes referred to as Kantian ethics. So it's important to look at the two main contributions that he made, even though they don't both really relate to this chapter, but it's something that we'll be coming back to when we have the chapter on ethics. Really powerful quote, an interesting quote and challenge by Immanuel Kant when you look at this statement here. Live your life as though your every act were to become universal law. Live your life as though your every act were to become universal law. So do you operate that way, or would you operate that way? Or just kind of imagine to yourself that whatever you do throughout the day, you commit a particular act, and then you say to yourself, I want everyone else to be able to do this too. Are you comfortable with everything you've done? If you would say everyone else should be able to do that too. So let's consider that. For our sakes right now, we may not necessarily need to have a real discussion about that too much. Maybe you can write that into your notes. We'll probably come back to this part of Kantian ethics later on. So if followed this universal law concept, how could Kant's challenge cause a better world? Would the world be better? But I think with this challenge, we also have to consider how could Kant's challenge cause harm? Is it possible that it would cause harm to operate that way? Of course, that's all looking at his ethics, and we'll first look at the area of epistemology. But a brief background here. So he was a Prussian German philosopher. So politically, he lived in an area known as Prussia. I mean, that was the state, that was the boundaries and the flag and all the military and those kind of things at the time he was alive. Culturally would be German. But there wasn't really a Germany at the time that he was alive. So kind of the area where we would view Prussia and modern day Germany today. So Germany wasn't in existence until 1871. And so that was several years after Kant had already passed away. But he's the first of many of the German philosophers that will at least have some recognition over here in this class. So we have Immanuel Kant, then we'll have some discussion about George Hegel, Karl Marx, and then Friedrich Nietzsche. And that's just a small sample of the number of German philosophers that are influential in Western philosophy. Well, Immanuel Kant believed that he had made a big contribution when it comes to the issue of epistemology. So similar to Copernicus, and that might be really, making a big statement, but this is an interesting way of looking at how we know. So it is the representation that makes the object possible rather than the object that makes the representation possible. So it's not enough to just see the object. You have to understand the object to some degree before you even see it. And so therefore, this whole viewpoint then of understanding the object is now going to be different, just as we look at rotation now being different, that it's not the Earth in the center and the sun rotating, it is the sun in the center and the Earth rotating. So you have to then have, in this case, this idea then of understanding something about the object before you actually physically see the object. One of these things that we have to spend some time thinking over. This is one of his better known quotes, which I think ties into what we just talked about there with the Copernicus revolution. Conceptions without perceptions are empty. Perceptions without conceptions are blind. So there has to be some combination of that going on. So what is now being in the mind when there is a physical interaction? And there has to then be a combination of both this concept and the perception going on to develop knowledge. And so that's important to consider how we have this combination. Conceptions without perceptions are empty. Perceptions without conceptions are blind. In some ways, when we look at the complication of Kantian epistemology, we can in one way say, well, this is actually pretty simple. And I can understand that, I can agree. And we can also say, wasn't this always obvious? But in many cases, situations may not necessarily be obvious until someone has been able to put that some way in writing and been able to make that contribution available to others. And then, yeah, we can stand back in retrospect and go, well, sure, that does seem rather obvious. So there are two elements that determine what we know. The external, based on senses, and this is in a way, kind of think back on the two previous slides, based on the senses, what we see, what we hear, and the eternal, what we process through our perceptions based on time and space. What we process through our perceptions based on time and space, what we sense and then what we perceive, what we physically experience and how it processes through our minds. So in this case then, we have this intuition, the presentation of some sensible objects to the mind. So what happens once we see something and now it's processed in our mind? In that situation, there is this combination of space and time. Space is empirical space that can be emptied and still have space. How would we know that? Does there have to be our experience for space to occur? There has to be a conclusion, no, that there is still space, even if we're not experiencing it. But how would we know that? And that's the use of pure space, which is geometry. Geometry is the science of pure space. You can do geometry without physically having a real thing to represent something in geometry, such as a triangle or a cube. You can have a cube in your mind. Or a cube can be there and you're not even there to experience it. So this does come back to the absurd thought experiment, that we can still see some relevance to it, to say, if there's a chair in a room, we see the chair, we leave the room, how do we know the chair is still there? We're not there to experience it. Well, the chair doesn't need us there to experience it because of space and time. And time, does time only exist if we experience it? Again, to Kant, it does not. There is pure time, and that's mathematics. And mathematics continues to work whether we're there to experience it. But experience is space and time in the external, the appearances of things. A lot to consider there, right? No doubt about it. And that's why I mentioned we're really in some heavy duty area of philosophy when we look at Immanuel Kant. So this is where we come to this issue of a concept, a cognition relating immediately to an object by means of some feature that several things have in common. Well, when we look this over then, and this comes from the site Kantian Terminology, when you see something, let's say that it's something that you've never seen before, your mind then goes through a process of trying to determine what does this thing have in common with other things. So it's not just the physical. It is also then going to involve intuition, your perception. What is your perception going to be? Can your perception be different based on space and time? Will your perception be different than my perception? And so there's where we can see how we can develop a different range of epistemology and how we might then experience things differently. So one of the terms that's oftentimes associated with Immanuel Kant is phenomenalism. This is Kant's compromise between rationalism and empiricism. And lots of things to unpack here. So perhaps one of the ways when we look at epistemology, a way to remember Immanuel Kant, really kind of to break it down, is to say, yeah, let's remember him as the individual that compromised between rationalism and empiricism. And one of the ways that he did that was to say, we do not see or hear the nominal world, which is the thing in itself. We don't actually see all that. We don't see the tree. We see only the phenomenon, the appearance of a thing. I see the appearance of a tree. And that doesn't mean the tree isn't real, but I'm seeing the tree differently than what another person may see for a variety of reasons. There we can see that compromise between rationalism and empiricism. It's not enough to just have the mind. It's not enough to just have the senses. There is a combination or some trade-off between those two. And another really important concept I like to see with Immanuel Kant is irremovable goggles. I always like this concept. You know, for many of you, perhaps maybe you're having some different experiences in your relationships with other people. If you're now in, let's say, the residence halls, living with different people that you haven't done before. And now maybe when you exchange different ideas or talk about different things and you have different reactions, or you see different reactions among people. And perhaps to some degree, it's been a little difficult to understand those differences. Well, maybe one of the ways now that you can accept those differences is to just think about this concept here, this image. Irremovable goggles. And you could just say, when you see a friend have a different reaction than you have to some event, you may say, well, that person has on a different set of irremovable goggles than you do. And so according to Kant, we perceive the world through irremovable goggles, which cause us to interpret everything we see based on the space and time that we live. This should mean that because we're from a similar culture and certainly a similar time, that we're going to have similar experiences and similar reactions to many things, but not necessarily always. And certainly we can look at different types of activities in terms of cultural activities or political activities that we may, social activities that we may not perceive the same because of our experiences and our background and perhaps our education and just our families may all cause us to then look at those events differently and then perceive them differently in our minds. And this may, in a way, help us to understand each other, knowing then that we have these different sets of goggles on. Let's use some application then to this idea of irremovable goggles. Let's go back, let's say in 1940, World War II is happening, lots of new experiences for people around the world. And let's say you have a situation where you have two people who are now going to experience seeing an airplane for the first time. One is a farm boy out in western Wyoming, and the United States has moved into let's record here, continue on with our recording. I had a bit of a pause there. I think that this will still make sense. So again, going back to our story, dealing with irremovable goggles and the perception of experiencing really the same physical object. So 1940, farm boy, Wyoming, never seen an airplane. 1940, let's say in the jungles of Papua New Guinea, an island north of Australia, which you have people who have never seen anyone outside their village. This individual also sees an airplane. So consider then, again, those sets of irremovable goggles. So the farm boy in Wyoming, while he's never seen an airplane, he's seen a car, he's seen some sort of mechanical devices, he's maybe heard someone talk about an airplane. So he has something that he can perceive in his mind when he sees this object fly overhead. Where the same boy in age, let's say the same age, 15-year-old, living in the jungles of New Guinea, has never even seen someone outside his village. So he's had no one ever even talked to him about an airplane. He's never seen anyone outside of his village. He's never seen someone of a different color than people in his village. He didn't really know that there were people living outside of his village. And now he sees a plane fly overhead. Well, they both saw the same object, but we can't in any way think that they both experienced that same object. There would certainly be some differences there for sure. And so I think we can see some ways in which this certainly makes sense, even though it's in many ways difficult to fully understand what Immanuel Kant is trying to bring out. But we can see then the way in which, when it comes to epistemology, we are going to be independent in that way. We are unique individuals in how we experience. But that then goes a different direction when we talk about morality. This is a very interesting contribution then to look at Immanuel Kant when we look at Kantian ethics. So we've looked at Kantian epistemology, but let's go ahead and stay with the subject of this Prussian philosopher and his other major contribution, and that is the Kantian ethics. And so there's a universal law of morality. So although Kant determined that we perceive differently, he argued that we must follow universal laws of morality or not have any morality. So let's consider that. So what does that mean? If killing were sometimes justified to solve our problems, then would it ever be punished? If people stole others' property, then there would be no property. So to say that we can go this direction in order to make our lives better at that time, to kill or to steal, it is then to mean that we must accept that other people can do that too. And then what does that mean about the whole concept of morality? So it must then be universal, the importance of universal laws, the opposite of what we had with epistemology. So based on Kant's belief that there is never a good time to commit an immoral act if the laws are universal. Based on Kant's belief, there is never a good time to commit an immoral act if the laws are universal. Can you think of a proper time to steal? Can you think of a proper time to lie? Let's see if we can make some contributions to that on chat. I'm sure we can. So we'll just pause and give you an opportunity to make some contributions there. Now, this leads to, of course, some maybe even over the top questions here for those who believe in Kantian ethics. But it does make us wonder, right? Again, going back to World War II, it does seem like a good example here. If you're living in the Netherlands, let's say, and you're hiding refugees in your house, and some of these individuals knock on your door, and they're wanting to know if you have any refugees in your house. So you have the SS coming there from, the very feared and hated German forces. And they want to know if you have any refugees in your house. Do you always tell the truth? Would you tell the truth then? Would it serve any purpose to do that? Would it be best to do that? So certainly one of the challenges we can see here about Kantian ethics. And this is another challenge to the idea of universal moral laws, the concept of dirty hands. The degree to which political authority, when wielded by otherwise decent persons, may be required to perform or to tolerate actions that would be seen as evil if they took place in the private sphere. So to look at that is to say, do we allow for those who have some form of political authority, certainly, let's say at the very high level, the president, director of national intelligence, generals and admirals, do we say that would we allow them to have a different set of ethics than the rest of us, and that they may be required to do some things that anyone in the private sphere would do. We would view that as evil and we would not approve. This is something we'll do on Wednesday. We'll go into greater detail about this in the discussion in our groups. And so look at this issue of ethics, something that we'll certainly be coming back to in our class. Do government leaders deserve to have dirty hands? Can they have a different set of ethics than what we expect from the rest of us? Again, we'll be discussing that on Wednesday. All right, so that's the end of our Chapter 3 discussions. Some really interesting philosophers that we've covered there, looking at this issue of empirical epistemology. We'll be moving on now to Chapter 4 in our next recording.